Um, so healthcare disparities are enormous and growing, particularly in the area of maternal and neonatal health among Black women and women of color. The COVID crisis has only put these disparities in even higher focus, with Black people and people of color experiencing higher morbidity and mortality rates and inadequate levels of medical care. What can we do to ensure that Black people and people of color do not continue to experience these vast disparities? And how can universal healthcare help to play a role in addressing health disparities?
We cannot let ourselves grow comfortable with anything of the status quo. We can't be part of a course of people that are calling for a return to normalcy. I don't want normalcy. What was normal before this crisis was unacceptable. And what I hope that through our activism we can do at the local, state, and federal level is continue to push policies and legislation that will actually help us to heal this gap and close the breach so that we can be a nation within our healthcare system that reflects our highest ideals, this ideal of equality for all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. So a question for you. We know that criminal justice reform at all levels is essential to reduce the disparate impact on Black people and people of color who suffer a disproportionate amount of bias in these systems, such as law enforcement, incarceration, and others. Along with eliminating racism, the YWCAs across our country focus on empowering women, and in particular, Black women and women of color. And we know that they experience bias as evidenced with lack of understanding around issues around domestic and sexual violence and law enforcement and other systems. How can we also ensure that the voices of women are included when we're addressing systemic racism and trying to make systemic change so that women, and in particularly Black women and women of color, can be included as part of the current focus for change in these systems?
Well, I think that this is a real crisis that we still have, that's persistent, about having women of color in the room when it happens, as they say. Let me just tell you a short story. I get to the United States Senate and I was stunned at the lack of diversity in the one of the most important legislative bodies, not only in our nation, but that we make decisions that affect the planet Earth. And there were there were few people of color on committee staffs or that I could see on critical areas. You could be a well-intentioned person, but if we don't have people with diverse lived experiences at the table, the policy won't affect that. And I'm going to self-implicate here. Another agenda of mine was reforming the criminal justice system that is so wretched in this country and so violating of our values, of our common principles and ideals. And I get to the Senate and I'm still talking about it, but women in a lot of the lectures I would give or forums I would be in would call me out and just say, even reflexively, I was only saying men. I was using the gendered term often. And I realized, to my own shame, that I had never, ever, I've been visiting prisons, federal and state prisons since I was a law student, but I had never visited a female penal institution. Never forget the warden, I asked her this question: how many women here are survivors of sexual trauma? And this tough woman stops, looks at me, and I saw her pain. And she said, about 90% of my women are survivors of rape and sexual trauma. I went in and finally met with the population. They had scheduled a big tour for me, but I actually just ended up sitting down with the women and the general population and just talking. My whole time I used just to talk and listen to them. And I heard awful stories about women who had to make terrible decisions between paying usurious costs to call their children, who were often separated in more than one household or foster home. And they have to make a decision whether they're going to pay those costs of phone calls or buy tampons. And they told me these stories about having to make their own tampons. And just the more I talked, the more I was outraged. And it led to me leaving, start working on a bill, and then call one of my partners, Elizabeth Warren, together. And we wrote a big bill called the Dignity Act, which before we could even get it passed in the United States Senate, about 12 different states picked up our legislation and introduced it because there was no defending it. I found myself going on national TV, constantly challenging the fact that we do not have menstrual equity in our prisons, and the conditions of women that were just so horrific that I couldn't believe it was 2014, 2015, and these Byzantine practices were still going on. That I have found it indispensable to have women at the table when my office is making policy. And so this is real. It's not a matter of it's nice to have diversity around the table. No, it's essential for crafting policy and correcting the vast disparities that exist. That we still in this country have such shameful corners of oppression that even the most conscious men and the well-intentioned men won't address unless women are actually leading and a part of the process of policymaking.